So is GDP or GDP per capita the best measure of our standard of living? And that's the big question. It's kind of a loaded question, but that's the big question that we want to ask in this particular section. So is real GDP or GDP per capita, the best measure of the standard of living? The best measure of the standard of living. Standard of living. And the standard of living is going to be sort of exactly that. So how well do the citizens within a particular country live? And the standard of living includes a lot more things than just income. It includes life expectancy, health outcomes, it includes technology, education, corruption. So there are a lot of variables that are included under the standard of living, but real GDP and GDP per capita, as we've already discussed, are only taking into account the income and the expenditure approach. It's just a measure of the final goods and services that a country produces within a given year. So generally speaking, GDP is not the best measure of the standard of living for any country, but we'd like to correlate it with it, or there's a very strong relationship that we like to sort of associate it with. And the reason why we do so is because the data for GDP is going to be very easy to collect and report. It's very easy to collect and report. So essentially in this case right here, the main reason why countries nowadays use GDP as the main measure of their standard of living is because the data is very easy to collect and report it to people like you and I. However, in any real measure of standard of living, we do notice that it omits many things. So this is where we're going to get in this particular video. So it omits many things. So what exactly does it omit? So take this for an example. Suppose that we take a look at two different countries. We take a look at Liechtenstein. So Liechtenstein is a very, very small country in Europe. It's right between Austria and Switzerland. And in Liechtenstein, the GDP per capita is roughly about $180,000. So $180,000, and that's in US dollars. So GDP per capita. GDP per capita. So remember what this GDP per capita tells us. It tells us that on average, the average citizen in Liechtenstein should be earning roughly about $180,000 per year. It's a very, very high amount. But suppose that we go ahead and compare this to, say, a country like India. So India, it has a huge nominal GDP, but it also has a lot of people compared to Liechtenstein. So Liechtenstein has a very small GDP, but it also has a very, very low population. So what do you think the GDP per capita in India is going to be? The GDP per capita in India right now is roughly about $1,900 in US dollars. So USD GDP per capita. So that tells us that the average person living in India is living off roughly about $1,900 per year. And we can see there's a very stark difference between these two countries right here. So it doesn't really tell us a lot about the income inequality that may be emerging within these countries. So we do know that there's a lot of people in India that make a lot of money. There's an even bigger amount of people in India that don't make a lot of money. They're very, very poor. So the GDP or real GDP really doesn't take into account income inequality at all. And that's one of the things that we would like to see in a standard of living measure. So just for comparison, where do you think the United States lies in terms of GDP per capita? So on average, the US GDP per capita is roughly about $60,000. So $60,000. So that tells us that the average person living in America should be earning roughly about $60,000 per year. So I think the vast majority of us here are well below that amount. But here, once again, this is one of the problems that we have with the GDP per capita. It's simply just an average measure. So essentially what we see right here, number one thing that it omits, the GDP per capita measure omits, is it does not take into account differences in wealth. So income inequality. We know there are a lot of people that make a lot of money. There's a lot of people that also don't make a lot of money. So here in this instance, we come to an average measure, and average measures can be very, very misleading in this case. Another thing that the GDP per capita or nominal GDP also uses is that it assumes that every single individual is identical to one another. And that's not going to be very indicative of reality and application. So another thing that it omits is that it assumes that all citizens are the same. So it assumes that all citizens are the same. So you're the same as me. I'm the same as the president. The president is the same as a hobo living out in the street corner. Essentially tells us that every single individual living in America should be earning this $60,000 per year, but this is going to be erroneous because we know there are very, very big differences in people in the country. So there are people that are going to be very good, upright, standing citizens. They are very productive. And there are going to be people that are sort of lollygaggers and don't really produce a lot in terms of the country. This measure right here doesn't really care if you are an upright student or if you're one of the many deviant students or perverts that we have here on campus at FIU. So essentially, this is one of the main measures, that one of the things that our GDP measures do omit. Yeah, so if you don't know, we do have a lot of deviants and perverts on campus, especially on the MMC campus. So you just want to go ahead and be aware of your surroundings. Two cases that I can sort of go off on a tangent and talk about is the one that is most prominent is probably the foot sniffer that we had on campus quite a few years ago. So if you ever go into the library on the second floor where there's the big atrium where there's a lot of tables and chairs, we actually saw there was actually a pretty old guy hiding underneath those tables right there and basically stealing people's shoes and sniffing people's feet. Someone actually called him out on it. He got startled and scared. He ran out of the library and the police actually chased after him and he crashed his car somewhere on 8th Street. So we had a foot sniffer here on campus, and it's pretty much one of the reasons why they installed the turnstiles into the library, and you actually have to have your ID to enter into the second floor. The other case that happened a few years before that was actually the booty bandit. So there was someone riding around on campus on a bicycle, and they were just riding around right behind people and grabbing people's behinds and their butts. And it actually became a really big issue during the semester that I was here as a student. And it happened at least half a dozen times, if I can remember correctly. It happened on the jogging path. It happened in front of the library. And the problem got so bad that you know how you get these alerts on your phone about the FIU alert, the system, and all of that. They actually sent out an alert about this guy, and they said, and we nicknamed him the Booty Bandit. And the police actually never caught him. So I guess the moral of the story is just to be aware of your surroundings anytime you're on campus, because we do have a lot of deviants on campus. So that's my little tangent in terms of this. So what else does the standard? What else should be included in a standard of living that is not necessarily accounted for in GDP? Something that we do leave out, of course, is the environmental quality. So environmental quality. So we do want a better environment. We want less pollution. We want less CO2. However, the GDP will never take into account environmental quality at all. It just tells us the amount of goods and services that we produce in a given year. And then finally here, another thing that we do omit is happiness. So happiness. So happiness is a sort of arbitrary measure for us, but we would like to see a very high level of happiness within our standard of living, but GDP cannot tell us exactly how happy countries are going to be. There are reports every single year that try to tell us exactly how happy countries are. The most famous one is going to be this World Happiness Report. And what countries do you think are going to rank at the top of world happiness? As we take a look at the ranking right here, we notice that the vast majority of these Scandinavian countries are going to rank at the top of happiness for a variety of reasons. So GDP per capita right here is one of the primary reasons, but there are other tertiary variables such as social support, life expectancy, freedom to make choices, generosity, and corruption. So here, these countries, they do have fairly high GDPs, but they also excel in other areas of life that other measures of standard of living. The United States, as you can see right here, ranks 19th. So even though we have the highest GDP in the world, we only rank 19th in terms of total happiness. So something unusual with that. And then finally here, the last thing that we do omit in terms of any GDP, in terms of any standard of living measurement, are going to be these non-market activities. So something that GDP does leave out as well are these non-market activities. And these non-market activities, we can informally call them the black market or the informal market. So black/informal market. So these non-market activities, they should be included in GDP, but they aren't going to be because they're either illegal or they're not reported. So this actually has the impact of reducing the amount of GDP that we have in the United States and also around in countries worldwide. Depending on the country that we take a look at, these non-market activities can lower the impact of GDP by roughly about 10 to 20%. So formally, these non-market activities are transactions conducted, but not licensed, and/or generate income that is not reported. So once again, these non-market activities, they are never going to be included in the calculation of GDP because these are transactions conducted but not licensed and/or generate income that is not reported. So here, what are a few examples of things that you would consider to be classified as non-market activities? So the example that probably pops into your mind are drugs, so illicit activities, of course. So drugs right here. So here, you're not going to go to your dealer and say, hey, I need a receipt for this particular transaction. A lot of it is done under the table. So here, drugs are going to be seen as of course, a non-market activity. They do generate some type of income for some people, but it's never going to be reported. Things like Craigslist will also fall along this line. So Craigslist. So a lot of things on Craigslist are legal, a lot of them are illegal as well, but these things typically are done with cash transactions and are not going to be reported. And non-market activities don't necessarily have to be illegal activities. They can be something as simple as you deciding to paint your own house. So if you decide to paint your own house, it's something that you do on your own, and it's never going to come into the calculation of GDP. However, if you decide to hire a painter or hire a contractor to paint your house, then that would be counted within GDP. Same thing in terms of maybe you deciding to take care of your grandparents instead of putting them in a nursing home, you deciding to grow your own garden instead of going to Publix to buy your groceries. So things along those lines. These are all considered to be non-market activities. And the example that we actually see on the slides that we're going to come to very, very shortly is actually tutoring. So a lot of mom and pop businesses, which are cash-only transactions, also tutoring, these are going to be seen as non-market activities because these are typically only going to be cash-only. There's no credit card, no checks, that type of deal. And I can actually give you an example from my own experiences with tutoring, and you guys tell me, or you guys think about this story and tell me whether or not this is a non-market activity or it's going to be counted within GDP. So if you don't know, I actually did my undergrad at FAU, so Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton. So very, very nice city, about an hour north of Miami. And during my time there, I was a TA for a class known as QMB. So QMB, Quantitative Methods of Business. And during my time there, I was a TA for this particular class, and at FAU, QMB was seen as the single hardest class in the business curriculum because this is essentially advanced statistics for business majors. So if you're a business major, you probably will have to take this class at some point in your lives, Quantitative Methods of Business, Advanced Statistics for you majors. So during my time, I was a TA for this particular class. So during my time there, the administration had a very bright idea of essentially transforming all the physical QMB classes to online. So the students were basically forced to take QMB online. They had to do their homework online. They had to take their exams online. They did all their lectures online. Anytime you transfer anything, a physical in-person class to online activities, what does this create a market for? It creates a market for people willing to take exams for other people. And who exactly was willing to provide these type of services? So nefarious people, people with loose morals, people looking to make a quick buck, so exactly people like me. So I decided to take QMB exams for people taking this class during my time there. And when I first started out, how much do you think I charged for an exam? I charged roughly about $100 per exam. I guaranteed you an A, you gave me $100. It was a very, very nice transaction. And if you were really, really good at doing your job, you could probably pump out maybe 3 or 4 of these exams in the time period that they allotted you. It was a very short time window, and they had about 3 to 4 exams. So I think 4 exams per semester. So all this extra money that I made, so that 4, 8, 12, that $1,200 I made during this particular semester, would that be seen in the calculation of GDP, or would this be seen as a non-market activity? Of course, it would be seen as a non-market activity because I am not an idiot. I did not report this. So therefore, tutoring services could be seen, in my experience, could be seen as a non-market activity. So this actually went on for an entire year, so 2 semesters. But the story keeps on continuing from there. Before one semester started, I asked myself exactly how much money I could charge without losing any customers. So I decided to test this out in the new semester. So new semester gets started around test time, midterm time is coming up, and basically, I have a meeting with a nice young lady, just making sure that she's not a rat. She's not a rat. She's on the up and up. So basically, we talk a little bit, and we come to the issue of price. She asked me exactly how much it's going to cost her to use my services. And what's the first number that pops into my head? You think it might be only just a little bit above the $100, but the first number that popped up into my head was $500. So I look her straight in the face and I say, $500. And what do you think this young lady does? She looks at me, she goes straight into her purse, she pulls out 5 crisp $100 bills and says, here's my login information, it's a pleasure doing business with you. And it was exactly at that time I knew that I could start charging $500 per exam, and that's exactly what I did. So all of that extra money that I made during that semester, would that be seen as a non-market activity, or would that be calculated within the calculation of GDP? Of course, once again, I am not an idiot, so this would be seen as a non-market activity, and that was a semester I was a very, very happy little boy. But of course, good times can't last forever. Shit hit the fan, basically. I got caught, and it's pretty much one of the reasons why I'm here at FIU rather than at FAU. So that pretty much does the end of that particular story. But as you can see right here with these non-market activities, there's a lot of things that we can do nowadays that should be included within the calculation of GDP, but for some reason it is not going to be. So we're going to classify that under the black or informal markets. So if you ever want to go ahead, if you have to take QMB, you guys know who to contact. I can definitely use the money. So essentially what we talked about in this particular section are a few of the shortcomings of GDP itself. What should we be including in any standard of living measure, but our calculation of GDP will never take into account. We talked about income inequality. We talked about that assumes that every single citizen is the same, is identical. We talked about environmental quality. We talked about happiness, and also these informal or non-market activities. So with all of this does do it for chapter number 5. We talked about the business cycle, we talked about GDP and the circular flow diagram, 2 different methods to calculating out gross domestic product. And in the next chapter, we're going to go ahead and talk about our next 2 big macroeconomic indicators, which is going to be unemployment and inflation. So a little bit of mathematics are going to be involved within that particular chapter. Good job with this chapter, and I'll see you guys next time.